apparently this section of Scripture, chapters 25 through 29, are the Proverbs that Hezekiah had assembled, that are attributed to Solomon. So, just a reminder as to who good King Hezekiah was. On the page 95 of your study guide, there is a box that is entitled, Good King Hezekiah. Would somebody read that for us?
Hezekiah succeeded his father, King Ahaz of Judah, at the age of 25. He reigned in Jerusalem for 29 years. Hezekiah was one of the few kings who led Judah closer to God instead of further away from him. He cleansed the Jerusalem temple and rededicated it solely to the worship of God. Then he celebrated his famous 14-day Passover in the temple for the first time in decades. Hezekiah revived the use of the Psalms of David and Asaph in worship and selected a committee to compile a collection of Solomon's Proverbs. He was also responsible for a water tunnel that he cut through the rock to connect Jerusalem to a spring outside the city. God rewarded Hezekiah's faithfulness by delivering Jerusalem from the Assyrians. God also granted Hezekiah 15 extra years of life after healing him of a disease. King Hezekiah's story can be found in 2 Kings 18 to 20, 2 Chronicles 19 to 32, and Isaiah 36 to 39.
So Patty can probably tell you more about this than I can, but in my brief time in Israel, when you're in Jerusalem, you can still see elements of Hezekiah's Jerusalem. That water tunnel is still there, and I remember when we were going through what is called the Cardo, they had a shaft. You look down, and the excavation from that layer was Hezekiah's layer of Jerusalem. And
so Patty, you've been to that tunnel then?
I have been through the tunnel twice.
That's what I thought you told me one time earlier. That's funny.
Right. We weren't given that opportunity. We were on a tour. We
open.
saw the tunnel.
It might not have been open to when you were there yet.
I don't know. We just saw the opening to it.
Yeah, because there's lights and there's not a lot of lights. You kind of carry your own. But there are a couple places where there's lights down, and you can see way down in, and it's kind of interesting, and it echoes a lot this year.
And it's a miracle because workers started at one end and started at the other end, and they met. And apparently, they had workers up above with rods stuck to the ground, and they were listening for noise.
Oh, okay. So they were actually using ancient sonar.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. All right. So when we get into this section of Proverbs now, apparently these are Proverbs that King Hezekiah's committee assembled, and again, the Bible indicates that Solomon wrote over 3,000 Proverbs in his life, so we don't have all of them. All right, would somebody read verses 1 through 10 of chapter 25?
These are more Proverbs of Solomon, compiled by the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah. It is the glory of God to conceal a matter. To search out a matter is the glory of kings. As the heavens are high and the earth is deep, so the hearts of kings are unsearchable. Remove the dross from the silver, and a silversmith can produce a vessel. Remove wicked officials from the king's presence, and his throne will be established through righteousness. Do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, "Come up here," than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. What you have seen with your eyes, do not bring hastily to court. For what you do in the end, if your neighbor puts you to shame. If you take your neighbor to court, do not betray another's confidence, or the one who hears it may shame you, and the charge against you will stand.
Okay, so basically we have two different topics here. One has to do with kings and their royal courts, and the other has to do with going to a court of law. So Anyway, the first of Solomon's Proverbs, and we're over on page 96 now, if you're following in the study guide, recorded concerns the importance of the king to society. Though God is all-knowing, there are some matters that he has concealed from humanity. He has gifted some, especially godly kings, to uncover those mysteries and presumably to explain them. And again, I firmly believe that God does reveal certain things to certain individuals, and they can understand some of the mysteries. We know that God gifted Solomon wisdom. He asked for it, and there's the famous story of him and the two women and the baby, and his solution proved right. They figured out who the real mother was. So God gifts devout leaders with the ability and determination to understand more than the average person. Now again, that's not to say that average people don't have wisdom. But again, remember, this is a different time. This was a time when kings ruled with absolute authority. We don't have that anymore. We have a republic that we live in, and supposedly we have a representative government that we vote upon, and they represent us. But in the old days, a king was absolute, and so he needed divine wisdom, because whatever he said went. There's a famous story of Alexander the Great, and I know I've told this in the past, but most of you have never heard this. But Alexander could tolerate no cowardice whatsoever. And so one time they went into battle, and this young man got scared, and he turned and ran. Well, they captured him, and they brought him before Alexander's court. And basically, he would listen to a case, and he would either give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And if it was a thumbs down, they took somebody out and executed him on the spot. Well, cowardice was, guilty of execution. So this young man, very nice-looking young man, is brought before Alexander, and he asks what the charge is, and he's furious. And he looks at this young man and finally says, "Young man, what is your name?" And the young man says, "Alexander, sir." And the king said, "What did you say?" And he said, "Alexander, sir." And then he shouted at him, "What is your name?" And he stood straight and shouted, "Alexander." And Alexander the Great pointed his finger and said, "Either change your behavior or change your name." Anyway, the kings had absolute authority. It was either thumbs up or thumbs down. And so we're seeing the wisdom that Solomon is looking for. By the way, early on, he seemed to be dependent upon God. But later on, he himself did not follow his own advice. And it says, next, Solomon compared the purification of silver to the purification of the royal court. Just as dross is removed from silver to purify it, so deceitful advisors were to be removed from the king's presence. So the king needed somebody he could trust. And so basically, again, it's this king in his absolute authority. If he doesn't like an advisor, they're out. He wanted people that he could trust and get good wisdom from. After establishing the king's wisdom and authority, Solomon warned his readers against self-aggrandizement. Try to say that word 10 times fast.
That'll be difficult.
The idea is trying to build yourself up, thinking more of yourself than you should. And the context is of some sort of a royal get-together, and you think you're so important, you just go ahead and sit up there at the front. And the warning is, don't do that, because if the king wants somebody else to sit there, he will publicly humiliate you. It's better that you stand afar and let the king ask you to come and be seated. And this reminds us of Luke chapter 14, verses 7 through 11, where Jesus has this, perhaps the same proverb in mind, when he spoke about a foolish man who claimed a place of honor at the wedding feast, only to be embarrassed when he was asked to move to a lesser position. I think about James and John, the sons of thunder, and remember what the big argument was? What were they arguing over? Yeah, who would get to sit at his right and left hand of the kingdom? And again, in those days, a king sat on his throne, and whoever sat immediately to the king's right was like his second hand.
His right-hand man. Yeah.
Right, his right-hand man, literally. And so they got into this big argument over it. All right, Solomon's final teaching in this section deals with personal conflicts, especially the type that can eventually end up in court. First, Solomon warned his readers to slow down and speak privately with the party involved before appealing to the judicial system. Because you go to court, it may not end up the way you think it's going to end up. So, and you can be publicly humiliated. So isn't it a lot better to try to work it out first of all? And your study guide reminds us of Jesus' words in Matthew chapter 18. Now again, that's not a court of law, but it has to do with the church. And it has to do with finding somebody who is in sin and going to them individually and trying to straighten this thing out and just settling it that way. If that doesn't work, then you take somebody with you. If that doesn't work, then you take it before the church body. If that still doesn't work, then you put that person out. But with the whole concept of restoration. And that is beautifully displayed in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, where Paul addresses the issue that the church is not this man who has a relationship with his own stepmother, and he says, if you're not going to do anything, I will. And he does. And in 2nd Corinthians, obviously the man has repented, and he's encouraging the church to restore this individual. So we need to remember that's the purpose of any sort of discipline within the church body, is always restoration. All right, let's take a look at the good neighbor, and that's in verses 11 through 17.
A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. As an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold, so it is a wise reprover to an obedient ear. As the cold of snow in the time of harvest, so is a faithful messenger to those who send him, and he refreshes the soul of his masters. Whoever boasts himself of a false gift is like clouds and wind without rain. By long forbearing is a prince persuaded, and a soft tongue breaks the bone. Have you found honey? Eat only as much as is sufficient for you, lest you be filled with it and vomit it. Withdraw your foot from your neighbor's house, lest he be weary of you and so hate you.
Okay. So, first of all, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. What do you think that means?
Well, if you have the truth, but speak it appropriately, it will be as to that person who hears it as a beautiful ornament.
Good, good. Your study guide points out something, I think it's perhaps a little bit picky, but many scholars believe the term applied, translated apple, should actually be apricots. Since apples in the region were of low quality. And so, if you go over to Yakima, my mother and mother-in-law and father-in-law used to drive over from the coast to Yakima, and they would buy boxes of fruit. And apricots is one of the things that she used to buy, and then she would go home and can everything by hand. And they had their own apples, so she would make her own applesauce, but they would do pears and peaches and apricots. And our children to this day don't like store-bought canned fruit because they're spoiled with grandma's homemade fruit. So, but anyway, words fitly spoken. So, in other words, again, when you compare Proverbs with James, these are both wisdom literature. and both have a lot to do with our tongue, with our mouth, and with the words that come out of them. So. All right, Solomon had equally kind words to say about humble listening. This he compared to valuable jewelry. And again, your study guide goes into what our natural tendency is, and that is when somebody criticizes us to fly off the handle, to deny it or whatever, but how many of us are actually willing to listen? Another valuable relationship skill is trustworthiness. And if you take a look at page 98 of your study guide, there is a column there entitled Royal Couriers. Would somebody read about royal couriers?
Communication between nations was a slow process in biblical times. There were no telephones, internet connections, or overnight delivery services available. Therefore, most kings had a company of couriers at their disposal. Usually, couriers carried written messages sealed with the royal insignia, but secret information was not written down for fear of the courier's capture. In those instances, the courier would be expected to memorize and deliver the message aloud. The courier, usually a young man, had to travel long distances through all kinds of weather, often along dangerous travel routes. If he carried bad news, he probably anticipated the king's anger. Angry kings were known to torture or kill couriers who carried unwelcome news. Couriers who carried messages to hostile kingdoms were often believed to be spies and were closely guarded. However, couriers were not always treated badly. When sent to friendly kings bearing good news, the courier would often receive a lavish welcome. Regardless of the greeting they received, couriers were indispensable in the ancient world.
So in our modern day of modern technology, it seems almost inconceivable of a time when that was the only official way of communication. However, we need to realize that even in this day of modern technology, not all information that we are given is correct. And again, there's been a lot lately about the news media and how they're slanting stories or telling what they want to tell or totally avoiding what they don't want to. And then just because somebody puts something online doesn't necessarily mean that it is right. And so we really do need to be very careful about what we do. So, in those days, when a courier showed up with a message from the king, it needed to be somebody they could trust. Because if given the wrong information, then things could really go awry.
So a courier could cause a war.
Well, during World War II, there is perhaps the most famous courier's response of all times. During the Battle of the Bulge, the Germans tried a counteroffensive, and they came to the little village of Bastogne, and there was an American unit held up there, and the Germans just wanted to keep on moving, so they ordered them to surrender, send a message. Anyway, the American commander returned a one-word message. Does anybody know what that is? Nuts.
Oh, that's right.
And the German commander is reading, nuts? What does that mean? Nuts. Anyway, they took it as a negative response. Well, the word got to General Patton. And when he had his Third Army, and when he heard that this American commander had replied nuts, he said, anybody who is that eloquent deserves rescuing. And so Patton put his full force in, and they rescued Bastogne. They stopped the offensive. But yeah, it was due to a one-word courier response. Nuts. All right. Okay. The opposite of a reliable messenger was a person who could not be trusted. And again, Solomon says that they are like clouds without rain. I don't know if you've ever really been in a dry situation and the sky clouds up and you want it to rain, but it doesn't. Okay, and that's what their lives are like. In contrast, the person who demonstrated steady perseverance could persuade a king. A gentle response could have a significant impact, so powerful in fact, that Solomon compared a soft but well-spoken response to the breaking of a bone. Now, what does that mean?
Impact.
The impact of it, yeah, has a lot of power. Self-control and moderation were virtues highly prized by Solomon. It is not surprising that he cautioned his readers against overindulging, and he uses the example of honey. Now, honey in the Bible is often highly prized, and we've learned a lot about ancient honey. Did you know that honey is the only food that does not spoil? At worst, it'll crystallize, but you can heat it up and it's still good. Honey can be used not only to raise your blood sugar and give you energy again. Honey can actually be used as an antibiotic. Did you know that if you're out in the woods and you get a bad scrape or cut, and if there's honey around, you can put honey on it, and it actually have a therapeutic value? So honey was a good thing in Scripture. But here, Solomon is warning about too much of a good thing. And it's kind of like our kids or grandkids, they see a dessert table and wow, they go after it. And the problem is they don't eat just a little, they eat too much and they get themselves sick. And that is what he's warning about. But again, it's not just food, it's any form of overindulgence. And then Solomon applied this principle to overextending one's welcome. Benjamin Franklin once said, "Fish and guests begin to stink after 3 days." And Solomon warned that a friendship could be ruined by visiting too often. So I think we've all known of some people that we wish would just kind of go away. It's one thing to have a friend over for a few minutes, but some people just don't want to go. So that's a warning. All right, difficult people in verses 18 through 28.
Like a club or a sword or a sharp arrow is one who gives false testimony against a neighbor. Like a broken tooth or a lame foot is reliance on the unfaithful in a time of trouble. Like one who takes away a garment on a cold day, or like vinegar poured on a wound, is one who sings songs to a heavy heart. If your enemy is hungry, give him food to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. Like a north wind that brings unexpected rain is a sly tongue, which provokes a horrified look. Better to live on a corner of the roof than share a house with a quarrelsome wife. Like cold water to a weary soul is good news from a distant land. Like a muddied spring or a polluted well are the righteous who give way to the wicked. It is not good to eat too much honey, nor is it honorable to search out matters that are too deep. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control.
Okay, very good, thank you. So a man who bears false witness against a neighbor is like a club, a sword, or a sharp arrow. It can be devastating. And again, there are actually laws now against perjury, because if you say a false thing, you can destroy a person's reputation. I think Alice can identify with verse 19. Confidence in an unfaithful man in a time of trouble is like a broken tooth and a foot out of joint. And so, if you have somebody that you're depending upon and you can't depend upon them, it's like having a toothache. And when you have a toothache, your tooth is a very, very small part of your body, but it's amazing how it affects everything you do. And then your foot, like a foot out of joint. I don't know how many of you have ever sprained your foot. Okay, well, you've got another one, right? You've got 2 feet, but it's amazing how it slows you down and affects your ability to perform when you've got a sprained foot or a sprained ankle or something like that. And so that is like confidence in an unfaithful person. He who takes away a garment in cold weather, and as vinegar on soda, so is he who sings songs to a heavy heart. Your study guide points out what they believe this means, and I think it's very appropriate. We as Christians, we as believers, have a tendency to think we need to fix everything in other people's lives. And sometimes the way we think that we should fix it is by telling them something good or positive. And so we come across a person who's going through a real difficult issue, and we say some trite, happy saying, and all it does is make things worse. You know, we are not commiserating with that person. We're not showing empathy to that person. We're just saying, oh, well, all things work together for good, right? And that's not how they're feeling at that moment. And so there's a danger. And for 26 years, I was not only a pastor, but I was also chaplain at the VA. And I've met a lot of individuals who are going through real crises in their life, maybe physical or other crises. And sometimes the best thing to do is just to be there. Sometimes the best thing to do is just to listen. Because sometimes we open our mouths and we think we're doing the right thing, but we can just make it worse, is the idea. So, all right. Here's an interesting pair, verses 21 and 22. If your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. So those are both positive, correct? Hungry, food, thirsty, water. So why do we often misinterpret verse 22? For you will heap coals of fire upon his head, and the Lord will reward you. And again, that reminds us of Jesus' words. But the concept here is not that you're going to bring judgment down upon this person. Okay? You know, we think putting burning coals on somebody's head, you're going to burn a hole in their head. But the idea is that in those days, they often carried pots on their head, whether it be water pots, food pots, or other pots. And the other thing is that in an ancient household, in order to cook your food or to keep the house warm, you had to have a fire. Well, if for some reason that fire went out, you didn't have a lighter, you didn't have matches or whatever. You needed to go get fire to make fire. And so what often people would do would go to a neighbor's and ask for some of the coals out of their fire. And so by taking some of those coals out of their fire and putting it in a pot, which generally they would carry on their head, you're doing a good thing. You're providing a heat source for them, a cooking source for them. You're meeting a practical need. It's not that you're calling down judgment, fire from heaven upon them. All right. The north wind brings rain, and a backbiting tongue, and angry countenance. So again, other words about our mouths and our tongues. I'm not going to even touch verse 24. Not going to even touch it. I think it is self-evident. Oh my. Verse 25. As cold water to a thirsty soul, so is good news from a far country. And again, we need to realize that in those days, they didn't have modern forms of communication like we do today. Even, and I am incredibly young, when I was born, we have in our family papers a telegram that my father sent to my aunt in Oregon announcing my birth. And she kept it. And she ended up giving it to my parents, and we have it in our family papers. Okay. How often do you get a telegram anymore with some important announcement? But anyway, that used to be a way of communicating, long distance, so. Okay, a righteous man falling down before the wicked is as a troubled fountain and a corrupt spring. That's evident. Verse 27, it is not good to eat much honey, for so men to search their own glory is not glory. And he who has no rule over his own spirit is like a city that is broken down without walls. On page 101 of your study guide, there is a box there entitled A Taxing Situation. Would somebody read that for us, please?
Many of Solomon's Proverbs warned against placing unnecessary burdens upon people. Proverbs 25, 20, and 24. Throughout his reign, however, Solomon did not take his own advice in this matter. Though Solomon's extravagant building program and lifestyle did much to impress neighboring nations, it also placed an excessive tax burden on the people of Israel. Solomon demanded heavy taxes from everyone and developed a system to ensure that the taxes were collected. He divided his kingdom into 12 districts, with Judah exempted, and collected from each district on its assigned month of the year. Olive growers gave olive oil, herders gave sheep and goats, farmers gave grain and straw. People who lived in cities paid in weights of silver. Solomon also taxed the people's time by demanding that every Israelite man labor for the king 1 month out of every 3. Considering the high taxes imposed on Israel, it's not surprising that after Solomon's death, the people begged Rehoboam to reduce their tax burden.
87,000?
Pardon me?
I said 87,000 is all I said.
Okay, yeah, I've got to be careful, again, because this is not a time for politics. But I will say that there are a number of people in our country who are very concerned about this whole topic, and that is taxes. And this morning I listened to, and I'll keep it anonymous, a U.S. senator who gave a speech on the floor of the U.S. Senate. And he quoted a famous former representative. His name was Colonel Davy Crockett. Davy Crockett served 2 terms in the U.S. House of Representatives back in the 1800s. Anyway, there's a famous speech that Crockett gave to Congress, and he actually quoted the speech. And again, there was a bill before Congress that was going to pay some individuals who were the victims of losing loved ones to war. And Crockett said, I am for veterans, I'm for the service to their country, I appreciate what these families have gone through, what they're going through, but I'm going to vote against this bill because this isn't our money. This is somebody else's money, and we're going to take somebody else's money and give it to somebody else. And he said that's not what the Constitution gives us the power to do. He said, although I am going to vote against this, I personally will donate 2 weeks of my salary to this organization. And by my calculation, if every other representative did the same thing, the money that we would give to this organization is more than what we're going to vote on. The bill failed. People listened to it, okay? But the whole concept was that when you tax, you're taking somebody else's money to give it to somebody else. And so it's one thing to give charity willingly out of your own pocket, but it's another thing to take money away from one person and give it to somebody else. And so anyway, Solomon did not even listen to his own advice. And again, he got his nation in trouble. Now, did they accomplish a lot? Oh yeah, there was huge building projects during King Solomon's time. Probably only equal maybe to King Herod during his time. I watched a video recently of Israel, where these archaeologists go throughout Israel and take a look at the remains of Herod's building. 2,000 years later, much of what he built either still stands or at least you can see the remains of it. It's incredible, the building projects that he put on. But again, he was a vicious man, and he accomplished a lot, but by other people's suffering. And so anyway, this is part of the warning that is going on here. Okay, I did want to just take a look at the page 101, the upper right-hand column. It says Solomon's next parable also mentions water. However, this water was tragically become unfit for use. Such a tragedy was a powerful comparison to a once righteous person who had turned away from God. Both the fallen person and the water that once had so much potential can now only bring illness and suffering. Only by God's miraculous intervention can either be made pure again. Solomon was a prime example of the truth of this proverb. After being a source of refreshment for his people, he eventually fell away from his first love for God and became a source of sorrow instead. And so, again, water can be a wonderful thing unless it's gone bad. It's become polluted, and then it'll just make you sick. So, Solomon used the last two proverbs of this chapter to encourage his readers to practice self-control in all aspects of life. He taught physical restraint in regard to overeating. He encouraged social restraint in his warning against being a social climber. Finally, he encouraged emotional restraint in comparing a person who lacks self-control to a city with broken down walls. Solomon wanted his readers to know that security and success rested on a person's ability to practice self-control in all aspects of life. And again, we've all met individuals who do not have self-control. And unfortunately, in our society, that often manifests itself in their use of money. And they get a check, and it's gone immediately. They just spend it away. All right, let's take a look now at the in brief section on page 102, Proverbs 26 through 29. Would somebody read that section for us?
The remainder of Solomon's Proverbs, compiled by Hezekiah's committee, cover a variety of subjects. A number of the Proverbs provide exaggerated descriptive snapshots of foolish personalities. Solomon described the shortcomings of such foolish persons as the sluggard, the quarreler, and the schemer. His caricatures warn his readers against associating with such people and encourage them not behave in a similar manner. As in the earlier collection of the parables, Solomon praised humility, self-control, honesty, and a teachable spirit. Can't help but do that. I think the most important thing that we can have, is we're a pretty old group here, somehow my prayer always is, Lord, help me still have a teachable spirit. I don't know it all. He warned his readers not to oppress the poor, loan money at or exorbitant interest rate, close their eyes to danger, or marry quarrelsome people. He also stressed the importance of developing healthy friendships. Solomon taught that such friendships would sharpen his reader mentally and morally and grant them greater security during life's difficulties. Solomon also stressed the importance of fearing God. God created all humankind, rich and poor. He gave the law, and he alone fairly dispenses justice. Only by seeking him could people understand real justice. Only by trusting God can people prosper. Only by fearing God is wisdom gained. Only by serving God will a country find stability.
So here's my concern. I agree 100% with this summary, but that is not what is being taught to our kids today.
No.
It's like we as a society no longer value these sort of morals or these sort of attributes. And what is being now proposed through this whole woke culture is absolutely unbelievable to me. It becomes hypocritical where they want to attribute all society's ills to one group of people, and therefore they become racist against that one group of people.
Well, don't you know that's you and me, Pastor and Don?
It is. It is.
We're old, we're male, and we're white, and we're Christian. We got all counts against us.
Exactly. Exactly.
We
Yeah.
won't mention the others that we got against us, but we got a few others too.
Well, at the University of California, I think it's at Berkeley, they have these student housing units. And they have this one housing unit now that is devoted only to people of color. And they now have a rule that white people aren't even allowed in the public areas.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes what I consider to be a reverse racism.
And the Minneapolis School Board passed this law that whenever a reduction in staff is required, it will be a white person.
Yes, exactly. So you have that aspect. And then you have this whole idea of gender identity that is now being taught in our schools to our kindergartners, to young impressionable minds.
College of the Ozarks just lost their case in court. They cannot discriminate against males who identify as females. They have to let them into the girls' dorm. They lost their case.
So, in Texas this week, a school board announced that they have put a bunch of books in their library under review. In other words, they think that they're going to eliminate them.
And
One of them is the Bible. The Bible. Another one is the Diary of Anne Frank.
I can't believe that.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah. Now, some of these books maybe do need to be reviewed. I don't know, but just because the Bible says some things that some people don't like. But again, but yeah, the Diary of Anne Frank, give me a break.
That's
So-
a big
They
one
don't
of
want you
story
to talk about past history
No, they don't.
because it's what's going on right now.
In the state of New Jersey, there's an elementary school this week that they've decided to change the name. It was Thomas Jefferson Elementary School. Well, because Jefferson owned slaves 200 years ago, he is now a bad person. And so they are now going to name the school after the first black woman who graduated from college in that area. You know, and it's, my point is this, I feel sorry for our children because they're growing up in a society right now that is just turning upside down, inside out, backwards, or whatever. And it reminds me of the scriptures where it says they called evil good and good evil.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what Paul was talking about, and we're living in it.
We're living in it, exactly. And so this list of attributes that Dan just read from us, that is a summary of these chapters of Proverbs, is just, like I say, it's foreign now to our culture.
That's why there's going to be more homeschooling.
Oh, yeah.
There's going to be more homeschooling. Interestingly enough, we used to have our kids at Liberty Christian School, and then the student population started dropping, and they started having to combine classes, and they only had like the grade school now they are opening up classes for all grades, and they're actually opening up high school classes again.
Yeah.
Which means to me that there's a lot of parents who are pulling their
Looking for
kids
some
out
answer.
of public schools and putting them into a private school.
And there are several that are making the decision to homeschool also.
Right. So, which is a
Even
real
Jared said he would
commitment.
homeschool
It's a
For
difficult
you, put
commitment.
his
It
kids in
is.
public
It is.
school.
And like I say, we had our kids
My kids would.
at Liberty for a couple of years because of what was going on at that time in the public school system. But on a pastor's salary, we just couldn't
Couldn't
afford
do
it. We just couldn't afford it. We finally had to put our kids back. So here is our daughters in first and second grade. And we have a meeting with the teachers, and they said, we love your daughters, and we are using your daughters to mentor the other kids. We're having them read to them. Because the other kids in first and second grade, they couldn't read. They said, obviously your daughters haven't been in public school, have they?
No.
Because they could read. So anyway, at least the couple of years that we did have them in private school, they got some of the 3 R's.
Several of you have met Tim, who's come with me a couple of times on Sunday night, my grandson, who's in 8th grade. We did a lesson again on Friday, and our lesson was on the authenticity of the Red Sea crossing, how both science and other fields of science and metallurgy, but also archaeology, have shown this is the spot, and they're finding chariot wheels under the Gulf of Aqaba.
Really? Yeah.
Isn't that cool? So that's the kind of thing you can get exposed to. But yeah, it costs my son and daughter, my daughter and son-in-law, about $3,500 a year to do this curriculum. But it's great, and I'm just loving teaching it to him. I got more excited than he did. But that's the kind of stuff I guess what I'm trying to say is that, and my other daughter does a lot of work within the homeschooling industry. There are some marvelous curriculums out there and I think we should be on our stump encouraging any family with younger children, if you possibly can, get your kids out of public school. And I say that with almost tears as somebody who was in the public education for 40 years. But I couldn't teach them now. I'd get fired the first morning.
All right, we need to get ready for our worship time.